Anything else with respect to construction? I would first like to the planning development. The city of London acknowledges that the area of the land of production of Canadian showing pays respect to the Black people of the region, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationships to the land. The city of London is also known in 1980 from Alberta, region 3. So again, hello, and welcome to the first of our 2022 reunited Advancing Education. Today, for our inaugural event, we're thrilled to welcome Shaundra Bruvall to the stage. Shaundra started working at Alpha House 3.5 years ago, currently overseeing all communications and community engagement. With backgrounds in policy and international relations, she's been teaching this workshop since she started at Alpha House for community groups, businesses, and not-for-profit organizations. Today we're going to hear a presentation entitled Engaging Vulnerable People. In this workshop, what we attempt to break down common myths and misconceptions that provide an understanding of homelessness and build the skills and knowledge that provide individuals and companies not only to coexist with men and women in their community, those who are experiencing homelessness, but also to interact with them meaningfully, using compassion, empathy, and crisis intervention techniques when necessary. Would you all please help me welcome Shaundra to the stage?
Oh, okay. I walk around a lot, so I'm going to need a wireless one here. And I also talk loud, so if the microphone's too much, please let me know. So thanks so much for showing up, for coming here. It's always, you never know when you just do a public session like this, if you're going to get folks to drop in, so really appreciate your time. My name's Shaundra, I'm the Communications Manager at Alpha House. I don't spend all my time in Lethbridge. I do spend a split between Calgary and Lethbridge, since we do have programs in both, and I would have loved to have been here more often, but there was a couple folks in the communications department you might have met instead that I've been working with as well. Oh, I just jumped ahead so many. This is a very touchy clicker. Oh no. Okay, I'm gonna have to be careful about that. So today, I just want to talk a little bit about Alpha House, just give a brief introduction in case folks aren't super familiar with all the stuff that goes on in that building, which is a large building, a potentially mysterious building at 802 2A Avenue. So just a little bit of background. So Alpha House operates the Lethbridge shelter currently. So our shelter is on kind of one half of the building, it's the west side of the building, and then there's our stabilization center on the east side, and then even further than that is the Lethbridge Soup Kitchen, which is run by a different organization than Alpha House. So Alpha House operates this shelter, it's 24/7, we offer showers, food, laundry service, so either clothing donations that we launder and we're able to hand out, or we also do client laundry as well, so they can come in, give their laundry and we're able to wash that and give that back to them as well. Obviously, immediate safe shelter, so the point of an emergency temporary crisis-oriented shelter is for safety in terms of a place to sleep, either overnight or during the day, etc. And then also referral to other social services. There is, I'm sure lots of questions in terms of the shelter. I'll be circumspect about kind of the work Alpha House is doing. So Alpha House is mandated specifically around addictions and mental health. So we were brought into Lethbridge in 2019, just in a really small way. So the shelter was operated by another agency, and we operated just a 15-bed shelter for folks who were under the influence. So we specifically come from an addictions background, withdrawal management, so our staff are trained in that way to support folks who are under the influence to help them towards stability or to help them towards other social services or long-term addiction treatment or whatever it is that they need in that moment. And then that soon expanded to a 30-bed shelter immediately, sort of right in that small space in one part of the shelter. And then we took on operations of the full shelter just right around the time that COVID happened, so around April 2020. And so we've been managing that shelter ever since. We also opened a stabilization center once we got to Lethbridge, so that was in November of that same year, so just a couple months after we started operating the shelter. And the stabilization center, it's not a full medical detox, but it does have medical supervision. And so we're able to safely support individuals who are detoxing from an addictive substance, again, towards stability. It's not a long-term addiction treatment program, but most addiction treatment programs require you to go through a detox before you can access services there. So that's one option for folks who are looking towards long-term addiction treatment programs. Oh gosh, that skipped like 10 slides. I don't know what I'm doing now. Alcohol's also opened a couple different programs inside a hotel in Lethbridge during the pandemic. And that was really as just a result of the pandemic and the folks that we serve. So individuals who didn't have an opportunity to isolate. And actually the shelter had one of the largest outbreaks in the province right around the beginning of December, sort of around that year. So we were able to open, isolation units in a hotel to support folks to safely complete isolation periods, and that was folks who either contracted COVID-19 or who were close contacts of folks. And you can imagine you're in a shelter, it's a congregate setting, it's very difficult not to, be right next to somebody kind of all of the time. So we were really, really pleased with the success of this program. We were able to support over 500 individuals to complete isolation periods. So that was really, really important work that we were able to do. And in that same program or same facility, a hotel in Lethbridge, we were able to operate transitional housing programs, which was really successful just in terms of stabilizing somebody. There are not, as I'm sure many folks in this room are aware, a ton of supportive housing program options in Lethbridge, right? It's certainly a gap in the system in terms of client care. But the transitional housing program was a way to, again, help somebody, find stability for, a period of time where they can then look at other aspects of their life and what, different short-term or long-term goals that they might have for themselves. And that level of stability, having a safe place to go at the end of the day, a warm place to be, access to food security, things like that, allows somebody to have then the brain capacity to say, okay, now I can maybe look further than the next 24 hours, right? I can look at something a little bit further down and say, what is it that I want? What is it that I need? How do I get, the things that I need in order to find that stability more long-term? Goals for today's workshop, there's lots of things on that slide. Really, the goal is to just start discussions about homelessness, addiction, some of the biases that we have. We're raised in a very particular society when it comes to thinking about minority groups or oppression or, systemic issues and things like that. And we have preconceived notions and we have a lot of biases. And there's a lot of stigma that comes out of that. So this workshop is not to make you feel bad for something that you might have thought in the past or for an interaction that you've had with somebody on the street, but it's just to challenge you a little bit to think about things maybe a little bit differently than you have before, or to just give you another avenue to think about some of the social issues that we do see on the street. We start the workshop typically from this lens, mostly because Alpha House's mandate is around addictions and mental health, and so it makes the most sense for us to do it from that lens because that's where our expertise comes in. But it's also a significant issue in terms of society right now, right? And not just folks who are on the street. It's first of all not true to say that everybody who is homeless is addicted, right? That's not a fair comparison or reality, but it is true to say that there is maybe a sickness or there is a struggle collectively in society when it comes to addiction, and we are seeing that play out in a lot of different ways. One of those ways is with the folks that we serve on the street. So when we talk about addictions, typically we talk about it from a lens of maybe pushing some buttons a little bit. So we focus really around why there's stigma associated with certain substance use and why that stigma doesn't exist with other substances, right? Alcohol is a very, very good example of that because it is very common in society, and it is actually one of the only substances that if you don't use it, that's considered weird, right? If you're out at a social engagement or anything basically past 5 p.m. and you're not indulging in wine or a beer or something, right? Somebody's maybe giving you the side eye, wondering why you're not, right? And that's a very, very odd thing when you also have those same individuals who would be, concerned or weirded out that you weren't consuming alcohol at a party, turn around and have stigma associated with somebody who's on the street who's intoxicated or using a different substance, right? And that really just stems from the stigma associated with why I think you're allowed to indulge in substance use, but this person's not allowed to use substances, right? And a lot of that comes from, racism is a big one in terms of there being, about 75% of the population that Alpha House serves at the shelter is Indigenous. So a lot of it comes from racism, but a lot of it just comes from the stigma associated with substance use in general, right? Recreational substance use is very, very common in society, and again, we just attribute certain things as being allowed. If you're rich, right, if you have wealth, there's a different set of stigma associated with that, which is to say there is no stigma associated with what you're doing at home in your own house, right? You're indulging in whatever substances, recreational, that you use, whereas somebody who's in poverty, well, then there's stigma associated with that because of a whole host of other reasons, right? So again, just to start kind of those conversations about why that is, we point this out when we do this workshop, and lots of people don't like it, but that's the point, just to make you kind of uncomfortable. But if you've gone to a bar or a pub and you've consumed alcohol, then you've used a supervised consumption site. And aren't you glad that your substance of choice is federally regulated so that you're not drinking moonshine and going blind, right? The amount is regulated and what's in it is regulated, and it's still a drug. And actually, it's different in Lethbridge, but in Calgary, alcohol is the #1 substance use that we see for folks in our detox. And it's also the one that's most fatal to withdrawal from, right? It's also the one that's most prevalent across society. Most people know somebody who has struggled with alcohol addiction. A lot of people don't necessarily know somebody who struggles with opioid addiction. Or if they do, it's a couple degrees removed. It's a family friend whose son, or, my uncle's ex's daughter, whatever, right? There's usually a little bit of separation, but most people know somebody who does struggle with alcohol addiction, or has. So from that lens, Alpha House operates from a harm reduction perspective. Harm reduction is just a concept of reducing negative consequences associated with something that's inherently risky. So there are lots of examples of harm reduction that we use in everyday life. The most common one that most people can relate to is the operation of a vehicle, right? Most people drive or have driven or do drive occasionally. That's inherently risky, right? There's inherent risks associated with getting behind the wheel of a vehicle, and accidents, vehicle collisions in North America are through the roof, and fatalities are through the roof. But we still drive, right? We still have decided, kind of collectively as a society, it's worth it for whatever convenience to operate vehicles. And so what we're going to do is try to make them safer. We're going to reduce the harm associated with using those. We're going to make people get licenses. You have to wear a seatbelt. You have to follow, traffic laws, all of those things, right? Those are harm reduction measures. Other ones are sunscreen. When you go outside, right, and it's super sunny, there's inherent risks associated with being out in the sun all of the time. So we wear sunscreen, right? There's lots and lots of examples just in everyday life that we don't even necessarily think about. The thing that Alpha House focuses on in terms of the harm reduction piece is that a lot of the folks that we work with might be unable or unwilling, for whatever reason, in that period of time to stop using. And so our goal is to keep them alive, to keep them safe long enough for them to make healthier or stabler choices, right? Whether that means manage substance use so that they can reconnect with family, or so that they can get a part-time job, or so that they can just have better health. That's the goal for each individual that we work with. And each individual is different as well in terms of their short and long-term needs with regards to their substance use. Just briefly, we talk about homelessness kind of on a continuum. And so on the one hand, you have folks who rough sleep, who don't typically have access to any services. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have those who are at risk of homelessness, right? Unsheltered, so this has been a topic of conversation in Lethbridge for months now, right? The encampment situation. There's a lot of reasons why somebody might choose to sleep outside as opposed to accessing a shelter. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a shelter, but they're not particularly pleasant places to sleep. And they weren't invented to be homes for people. And I think that people forget that in the conversation of, well, we need to add shelter capacity, or we need to make sure these shelters are doing X, Y, or Z, or if people aren't going to the shelter, there must be something wrong with the shelter. And the thing is, they are short-term emergency responses to a problem. And we have normalized homelessness in society so much for so long that shelters have somehow become this answer or solution to homelessness, which is, we know, not the case, right? We know that housing is a big part of the solution to homelessness. And so while, yes, shelters should be appropriately funded, and yes, they should be clean, and yes, they should have safe spaces, be safe spaces for people, it's akin, I think the best way to kind of make an analogy for it for most people is like sleeping in an airport, right? It's kind of cold, it's very busy, there's like beeping noises coming from different places and you're not sure where they're coming from, there's doors opening all the time, you're worried about your stuff getting stolen, and there's people coming in and out all the time, right? Now, shelters are meant for durability. They are meant for hundreds of people to be moving through in that space at any given time on a single day. So there needs to be certain things in place. They're not the most comfortable. They're not super private, right? Because they can't be. And so the solution isn't more shelters and bigger shelters and all of these things. The solution is put people in homes, right? Emergency shelter, of course, refers to shelters in the city. Provisionally accommodated is that kind of contingent of folks who have temporary accommodation, but they're going to lose that accommodation if they're discharged from hospital, they don't have a discharge plan, or if they are released from remand, they don't have a discharge plan, they're going to end up back on the street. At risk of homelessness, there's a huge conglomerate in this kind of category. It could be as simple as somebody who's spending over 50% of their income on their accommodations, or it could also be what we call hidden homelessness, which typically refers to youth who are more likely to couch surf or stay with friends than adults are, or it refers to people in domestic violence situations where they're choosing to stay in a relationship that's unhealthy for them because the alternative would be to end up on the street. Oh my gosh. I don't know why I struggle with this. Oh, I'm sorry, everybody. I don't know. I won't risk going back. We'll just stay on this one. Okay, so the last slide that's there, that point in time count, is actually outdated data because very recently they conducted another point in time count. For those who don't know, it is literally a count, 1, 2, 3, 4 of individuals who are staying in shelters, individuals who are on the street, and those who are, temporarily accommodated but are, theoretically they're on the street, right? They're experiencing homelessness. That point in time count, I think there was a preliminary number that was released, but whatever that number ends up being when the actual report is released, what we do know is that we have seen an increase in folks who are experiencing homelessness. And we've seen that at our shelter. We're seeing, we saw, roughly 1,000 unique clients in the past fiscal year, and then this fiscal year was closer to 1,600. So we already knew that we were seeing that increase, right? And sometimes you have, again, that episodic homelessness where somebody maybe has seasonal labor jobs, and so they have kind of accommodations certain times of the year, or they're in a relationship where they're with family, but then that relationship with their family or with their spouse or significant other doesn't go well, so they're back on the street. So we know there is some transitional aspects to it, but in general, what we are seeing is an increase. And there's, I imagine, plenty of studies in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of addictions and substance use and affordability, in terms of housing, that could give us more insight into why that's happening. And that matters, absolutely, but it also matters to talk about what we're going to do about it as well. And this is a study that was done in Alberta, but through the Calgary Homeless Foundation. The most common reasons, and you just focus on this one, the most common reasons for loss of housing, so substance abuse and addictions was one of the top ones there, which we do know. A lot of the other ones are just an inability to have stable housing, either because of a relationship or because of your income, right? So again, we need to be talking about what are those solutions to that, right? What are solutions to housing, and we're going to talk about that. Sorry, I'm skipping this slide. Now it's running on me. Oh my gosh. Okay. So we'll just briefly talk about a housing first concept. It's not on this slide, but housing first is the idea or the foundational concept that somebody who has access to stable housing will then be able to work on other aspects of their lives. And so when we talk about solutions in terms of housing, one of the things we do try to talk about is a spectrum of supported housing. So folks who require, a harm reduction program where they can manage their substance use, where abstinence or sobriety is not a requirement. Folks who need support with their mental health, right? They need somebody to be administering medication consistently throughout the day, or we need that spectrum where people who have these specific individualized needs are able to have those needs met. And I'll share a stat because I think it's helpful to know if you don't already, but how much more economically sound it is for us to fund supportive housing programs than it is to let issues linger and carry on. So first of all, it's much less expensive to fund supportive housing than it is to fund shelters, and it's way less expensive to fund supportive housing than it is to fund hospitals, right? So if you have somebody who's been on the street for 3, 4, 5 years, 10 years, and they have a common problem that you or I would just go to the doctor for, get it taken care of, and then not have to worry about it again. All of a sudden, that problem for them, because they don't have access to healthcare or don't have access to a safe place to redress a wound, or they get an infection or things like that. That persists, that gets worse, and then all of a sudden they spend 5 days in the ER taking care of something that never should have been an emergency in the first place, right? So all of that is costing money that is super unnecessary. And so there's tons of studies, and I encourage you to look if you're interested about the benefits, economic and social benefits of supporting folks who are high-frequency users of hospitals, of police, of EMS, into supportive housing programs. We had a gentleman that accessed our transitional housing program, and this was somebody who, I kid you not, had an interaction with police every single day. Every single day there was something that police were having to respond to involving this individual. He was housed in our transitional housing program for 4 weeks, and there was nothing, not a single call. And that's not because he was staying inside all the time. It's because he had supports that he didn't have before. He had somebody to talk to him when he was getting really anxious that was leading to some of those interactions with police, right? And that's a really, really simple, very small case example of how we can remove unnecessary burdens on public services just by supporting somebody with the needs that they have. We talk a lot about trauma in our work because we know, that a significant percentage of addiction stems from traumatic experiences. The other thing we do try to talk about in terms of trauma is having a trauma-informed care lens when we do any work with any individuals. It's the assumption that anybody that you're interacting with has traumas in their past, and your goal in supporting them, in whatever way you are supporting them, is to ensure that they're not being re-traumatized through that support, right? Trauma is a lasting emotional response that results from living through a distressing event. The biggest thing to note, there's a couple, but one of the biggest things to note about this trauma piece is that you don't get to decide what's traumatic for somebody and what's not, right? Two people can have very, very similar upbringings. They can be, the same age, the same ethnicity, they can have, the same wealth or same class structure and experience, the same event, a car accident, let's say. They both get into a car accident. And the one person is fine, they get up the next day and they can drive, and the other person can't drive for a year, can't get behind the wheel, or can't even be a passenger in a car. And that impacts every single aspect of their life in terms of where they can work, in terms of the strain it puts on different relationships that they have in their life because they need rides all the time, etc., etc. And that's a response to trauma. Even though these people had the same kind of resiliency structures, one person experienced a traumatic situation as a result, and the other didn't. Or that other person maybe doesn't have anything happen until 6 months down the road. And then all of a sudden they can't function the way they used to, and they don't understand why. And it's, again, because of that experience that they had. And that's a very, very simple example, right? In Alberta, over 33% of Albertans have experienced at least 3 negative adverse childhood experiences. And that can be anything from, just neglect to verbal, physical, sexual abuse. Can be, the death of somebody who, very important to them when they were really, really young. That period of growth between, age 0 to 10, it's mostly age 0 to 5, when your brain is developing, is critical in terms of your ability to deal with, issues, deal with stressors later on in life. And if you don't have that resiliency built, then every single stress becomes a traumatic incident that you have to then deal with the fallout of. And we're, at the shelter, we're looking at folks who, there's a lot of brain injuries that we see. There's a significant number who struggle with fetal alcohol syndrome, where they, cannot cognitively process, if I do this, then that means this will happen. And if I don't want this to happen, I shouldn't do this. They don't have the ability to cognitively process that, right? Like if anybody has a teenager, that sometimes you're like, well, honey, why did you do that? And they're like, well, I wanted to do that. Well, didn't you know that this was going to result? Well, yeah, but I still wanted to do that, right? Like they can't necessarily get from action to consequence. And a lot of that is the work that we're doing. And it's not to justify actions, right? We don't talk about trauma to justify somebody's behavior or theft or violence or anything like that. We talk about it as a way to help bridge the gap in terms of understanding why it's so frustrating when your loved one is doing something that's harming their life and you can't understand why it's happening, right? A lot of that is stemming from trauma. It can be very, very frustrating and upsetting to watch somebody make decisions that you can see as being harmful and you can't necessarily get through to them why that's happening, right? A lot of trauma is a big part of that. Just checking time here. Okay, so we talk in this workshop, this is the second session, if you will, where we talk a lot about actual interactions with folks on the street. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a scenario in terms of assessment of the situation, okay? And the reason that we do this, and I'll just do a caveat up front, is not to make you feel guilty for not interacting with somebody. It's not to say, oh, yeah, this lady did a presentation and she told us that we're horrible people if we don't interact with every person that we see on the street. That's not the point of this, right? The point, again, is to challenge some of those things that we have. We live in a society where the first thing that pops into our head is a lot of really ingrained things that you can't do a lot about, right? You walk past somebody on the street and you have a fear-based response, and then the second thought that pops into your head is, well, actually, that's just a person, and they just look different than me. That's the only thing, right? It's that second thought that we're focusing on, not the first one. We can't help the visceral, physical reactions that we have to things, and they're good, right? It's good to have fear-based responses because that tells us that there's something that we need to be wary of, right? But it's about perception versus actuality when we talk about those responses. In a situation where I don't know if there's anybody who's been into the Tim Hortons that's on Stafford Drive there, it's right by the shelter. There's often somebody who's sitting on the curb before you walk into the store. Maybe they're panhandling, maybe they're just sitting there, etc. Sometimes there's a group of folks. In a situation where, let's say, you're walking into that store, it's kind of broad daylight, there's lots of people, you've seen somebody coming in and out past, this gentleman who's sitting down on the curb right by the door. And this person is, maybe there's mental health, maybe there's, substance use involved, you don't know, because all you can do is assess the situation that you see, right? So you've got this individual who's sitting down. They're not really making eye contact with anybody. They're not asking for anything. You can see that they're moving because sometimes they'll look around. You can see both their hands. So by all accounts, in this situation, the level of actual danger is very low. Okay? You are not more likely to be in a violent situation with somebody who's experiencing homelessness than you are any other stranger on the street, right? That's not true to say that there's inherent violence associated with somebody who exists on the street. In that situation, we have lots and lots of people who do these workshops, or just general community members who tell us, yeah, I'd take a wide berth. I would walk as wide as I could to get into that store, or I would wait until somebody was coming out so that there was a buffer between me and that person. And that's a stigma-based response, a fear-based response based on the presentation of that person. That person looks a little rough, or they're Indigenous, right? Which is a huge problem in terms of the racism that we see. You have this visceral reaction based on just how that person is presenting. You are not assessing any other factors in that situation, right? You're not looking at the fact that you've seen people walk past this guy, and he didn't even notice them because he didn't care. And you see, it's broad daylight, and you're standing and he's sitting, and you can see that there's no weapons involved, right? There's no actual external factors making a decision that means it's a dangerous situation, right? If we're feeling that fear, that's based on just the presentation of our perception of danger. And so really it's just about, challenging yourself. If you have that initial reaction of, oh, this is a scary situation, force yourself to take a deep breath. If you need to stop your movement forward to assess differently, then do that and think, okay, what is the actual reality here? What is the actual likelihood of danger in this situation based on what I can observe? Body language, I would love to be able to tell you that if somebody is doing this with their body, then that means yes, they want to interact, or no, they don't want to interact, or this means a certain substance is being used, etc. But things present very differently in different people, right? Lack of eye contact does not mean that somebody might not want to interact with you, right? Darty eye might not mean that they're on something, right? It could just be a wide variety of personal and human attributes that we're, again, forcing into a little box of mental health or substance use. But we can focus on our body language. Okay, so body language is very, very important in terms of somebody else's perception of your threat to them, right? It's that, that idea of that whatever animal is more scared of you than you are of it sort of thing. There is a truth to that. So our body language, we think about, first of all, when we sometimes get people who are like, if they are scared, right, the first thing they'll do is sort of try to protect themselves, right? They'll kind of hide it on themselves, they'll pull themselves, their arms in tight, and they'll kind of turn their head, and they'll start to walk fast, right? What happens when we do that? Our heart rate increases, right? We're forcing ourselves, our body, to have a fear-based reaction just because we've decided we need to be really close, we need to protect ourselves, right? And so that an interaction, let's say you do have an interaction, let's say that gentleman stands up as you're walking by, and you have already told your body there's danger associated with this situation. Is your interaction with that person going to be pleasant? Probably not, right? Because we're operating automatically from a perspective of this person's dangerous, right? Whereas what we typically want ourselves to do, shoulders back, we want our eyes observing the situation, right, to assess if there is going to be a change in the situation, and we want to approach never from head on. Okay, so when we talk about body language, we also talk about distance. If we're going to interact with somebody, we want to be able to assess the situation. We talk about a distance that allows us to see their reaction to us, and then make a different assessment kind of as the situation evolves, right? And we talk about not being head-on with somebody, right? If you stand up and you need to walk over to this person because they're somewhere that they shouldn't be, or because you're worried about their safety, or you're just going to check in on them. If your approach is to go head-on to somebody, right? If someone walks up to you, starts walking up to you, and they're square head-on, looking you straight in the eyes, like, what's your reaction? I feel like I've done something wrong, right? Like, there's something's happened. Same thing is going to happen if you're approaching somebody like that. So our body language needs to be more relaxed. We're, again, observing the situation, and we're not doing it from a confrontational perspective, right? We want to be sort of on a diagonal all the time in an allyship type of presentation, right? We want to approach it as though, hey, how are things going? As opposed to, hey, you shouldn't be here, right? One's confrontational and is going to result in escalation, and the other provides an opportunity for that allyship, for them to say, oh, well, actually, I've had a bit of a rough night, or whatever, right? I'll talk just briefly about the concept of unworthy versus worthy poor, which I've mentioned, but I'll say it again because it bears repeating. We have more natural compassion for somebody that we think is a victim of their circumstance than somebody who we think is in that situation as a result of their own choices, right? So we typically have more compassion for, children who are on the street. We have more compassion for women than men who are on the street. Particularly, we have more compassion often where racism involved. We have more compassion for a white individual who's on the street as opposed to an indigenous individual who's on the street. If it's an indigenous man in his early 20s, where we think, oh, that person should have a job, we have way less natural compassion for that situation, right? Because we think that they've done something to deserve or to earn the fact that they're experiencing homelessness. And it's not to say that people don't have different experiences on the street. Yes, it is more dangerous for women typically. Yes, it is more upsetting, for there to be a 15, 16-year-old on the street, right? Because we want to stop the pipeline sort of thing, right? We still think that there's an opportunity to just shelter them a little bit. Whereas adults, we have maybe less, compassion for because maybe they have more faculties about them, right? They've lived a little bit longer, they have maybe a little bit more skills. And the point of that is just to say, you don't know anybody's story, right? And so to assess and to assign certain levels of compassion to somebody based on your perception of their life is really, really unfair, right? And I'll just mention as well, agency in terms of the client. In the same way that you have every right to say, no, I actually don't want to interact with this individual today, that person has every right to say, no, I don't want to interact with this stranger today, right? Had a woman who did this workshop, and she was really, really upset because she had an interaction. She likes to give out sandwiches to folks on the street, and she had given a gentleman a sandwich, and he had just thrown it on the ground, like he was like annoyed by it. And she was so upset. Well, I'm just trying to be helpful. Why would you do that, etc., etc. But if you're somebody who has very few choices in your day-to-day, you get to choose which shelter to go to. Lucky you, right? You don't have a lot of options. Whatever meal is being served at the soup kitchen, that's the meal that you get. And all of a sudden, this person who does want to help you comes up, and instead of asking what you need, they give you something that you didn't ask for and that you don't want. And you're expected, this person who is, doing this good thing so that they can pat themselves on the back, they're expecting you to be grateful for that. And that imposition of expectation can be very, very frustrating for somebody who is used to being told to move along, that you can't be here, used to people not even looking at them, etc., etc. And all of a sudden, they're supposed to say thank you for something that they didn't ask for. And it sounds harsh, right? We talk about, well, beggars can't be choosers, but actually beggars can be choosers. They can be, right? Everybody has the agency to make those choices, and you shouldn't take that away from somebody any more than you would be okay with somebody taking that option or that choice or that agency from you. Okay. We talk about this. This is a verbal resolution model in terms of crisis prevention, intervention. It's very important to note that not everybody that you see on the street is in a state of crisis, right? Maybe they're having a good day. Maybe they, just got picked up for a housing program. Maybe they just had a great, hangout with their friends, etc. So not everybody that you see is going to be in a state of crisis. But these are general tips in terms of a couple different presentations of behavior, and then some of the responses that we can use to help make it a positive or at the very least a neutral interaction with somebody. Oh God, I was doing so good. I'm pressing 6 buttons at a time. Okay. Anxiety. This typically presents as agitation, right? So a lot of the time, this is where you'll get somebody who's definitely not like, oh, I don't want to interact with that person because they're sending off signals that I'm scared of, right? And a lot of the time, that's because there's actionable items to them, right? They might be pacing. You see people pacing a lot, or they just like they can't sit still, right? They're a little bit jumpy. Had an individual who had a bit of a tic, like he just moved his arm like this. And I was waiting by the bus station, and he came up to talk, which was fine. We chatted for a little bit, but he couldn't stop, like the whole time, couldn't stop doing this. And pretty much everybody else, because of the way he was walking when he did it, he's kind of slouched. They were like, yeah, again, oh, don't want to stand near that guy, right? We had a very pleasant conversation for 10 minutes, but he couldn't stop. And if you're basing it just on the presentation of somebody, well, that seems concerning. Probably there's substance use involved. There's no substance use involved. He just couldn't stop moving his arm, right? But we're again, we don't want to make some of those judgments. In a situation where somebody feels like they're not being heard, feels like they're not able to access anything that they want, there's a lot of agitation, so it manifests itself typically in some of those behaviors where we're pacing or where we're huffing, right? We're like verbally making some noises, and it's just typically an anxiety thing. Maybe there's substance use involved, maybe there's not. In this situation, we typically want to respond with empathy and support, and we want to give options. So I'll give you an example. So there's a gentleman who was waiting outside the shelter to come in, and there's an intake process in the shelter, so we bring one person in at a time, we do a pat down, we check their bags into our storage so they don't have to worry about their stuff getting stolen while they're sleeping. And then they move into the shelter, or they move into the stabilization program, and then the next person comes in. So sometimes there's 2 or 3 people who are waiting outside. And this gentleman was agitated, right? Like he was kind of like occasionally he'd be pacing up and forth, and then occasionally he would just like kind of growl, like he was really, really frustrated. And there's outside staff, but they were doing a round of the property, so he couldn't get to the front of the line, and the staff member who was bringing in the next person couldn't necessarily see him, right? And so he was getting, more and more agitated. And eventually our staff noticed, and we went out and said, John, what's going on, man? Like, what's up? And again, where you approach it as an allyship, tell us what's going on, man. It's very casual, it's very friendly. It's not, whoa, you have to calm down, right? Which, I don't know if anybody out there has been told to calm down. You do not calm down when somebody tells you to calm down. You get more mad. So definitely a situation where, again, we're approaching it from a casual situation, from the side, right? We're not coming up, confronting him, we're saying, hey, like, what's going on, man? You seem like something's upset you. Can we help? Is there something I can do for you? Very, very easy phrase to be able to use to kind of change the tone of the conversation immediately. Is there something we can do for you? Like, what's up? Tell us what's up. And all he wanted was to use the phone. Clients can use the phone at the front of the desk, but he didn't want to check into the shelter. So he didn't want to wait in line because he didn't want them to think that he was doing intake, because he didn't want to do intake. He just wanted to use the phone. And so our staff said, yeah, John, that's fine. Give me 2 minutes to check in this next person, and then we'll bring you in, you can use the phone, and then you can come back out. So again, you don't really get to the bottom of why this person is behaving the way you do without some of that interaction of slow down, take a breath, and tell me what it is that's got you so upset, right? Let's see if we can come to a solution. Let's see if I've got some options for you, right? Oh. Intimidation is this thing called? It's one before this. There we go. Defensiveness. Okay, so potentially it's slightly escalated or more emotional than anxiety. Defensiveness, where they're maybe attempting to draw you into some kind of power struggle, or they are interacting with you, but it's in a very distracted way. They're not really seeing you, right? And your responses, not necessarily what's getting through, right? You can't really stay on topic. So you might see this a lot of time where you see someone walking down the street, it looks like they're talking to themselves, right? If you were to approach, they might not really hear what it is you're saying, or it might take a couple times for it to get through, right? Because they're not reacting to what you're doing, right? They're reacting to something that's in their head. So in this situation, short, clear, simple directives is very, very helpful. And you want to think about boundaries, right? You don't want to get pulled into a role that you can't play. Is there something that's upset you? And again, we're from a distance and we're, on an angle as opposed to confronting somebody. But we're looking at short, clear, simple directives. So is there something that's upset you? Or is everything okay? And sort of meeting somebody on their level. And we also want to set the tone, right? We don't want to match tone. So we don't want to match someone's behavior in terms of their level of escalation. We want to bring somebody down. So we typically go from a casual point of view or a casual tone in terms of, is everything okay? Or, how are things going? And it doesn't necessarily even have to be like I'm specifically talking to you, right? It could even be like, hey, I'm glancing around and I happen to notice, hey, like, is everything okay? You seem out of sorts. And then again, I'm still looking around, or I'm still kind of maybe pursuing whatever it was I was doing before. I'm still walking next to you, and they have then that opportunity to engage with you. And maybe you do it 2 or 3 times as you're kind of going, is everything okay? And it maybe takes 1 or 2 times before they can kind of see that somebody is talking to them. This was in Calgary. I was doing a shift with our outreach team. And we go all over the city. We typically do transports from post to shelter, similar to the DOT team in Lethbridge. And there was an individual who he looked like he'd just been through the ringer, right? Like he just was having a crappy morning. And so we kind of approached, and it was again like it was almost like he couldn't see that we were there, right? There was sort of a picnic table. Like he was on one side, and so we kind of approached, and I sat down again just to he's standing, right? Just to maybe give him that comfort level of he's the one who's sort of in the situation, or he has a little bit more control in the situation, and I'm just there to listen. They said, hey, how are things going? Are you okay? And again, he's kind of muttering to himself, he was kind of looking around, he was angry, like you could see like there was a lot of anger, you could hear it in his voice. And again, I, let him say whatever it is he says, and I'm looking to set tone, right? Again, more casual. We are here from, the go team, like, can we get your ride somewhere? Which is, again, not something that any of you would probably say, because you're not necessarily going to transport individuals, but is there something I can get you? Like, is everything okay? Things seem kind of rough. Can I buy you a coffee, right? Some of those things. And eventually, we get to a point where he can, okay, yeah, somebody is trying to engage with me, and he can get through, whatever's in his head. And he tells us, yeah, he got cougar mace last night, and one of his bags got stolen. So he just had been having a rough night. He said, can we get you to a shelter? He said, no, I'm actually going to the health center. I said, okay, great, we can give you right there. He's like, no, I want to walk it off. Like, I'm going to walk it off before I have to go inside. Like, okay, great. So we walked with him for a little bit, right? And again, just some companionship that was maybe helpful for him to feel like he was a little bit safer than he had felt that night. Intimidation. Typically, we don't engage in a situation where we do see somebody's level of agitation is so much that there's maybe verbal threats happening or there's property damage happening. I'm going to add a caveat to this that maybe offends some people, not offends, but concerns some people. If there's no criminal activity happening and this person is just going through it and having a bit of a mental episode, that's going to wear off, right? Because a lot of the time people will come down and there's no criminal activity happening. If you can call the non-emergency line instead of 911, right? You call 911 on this person. Like this is I was at Analog Books, and you know how there's parking on both sides of the diagonal parking, but this guy was walking down the street, down the middle of the cars, but it was kind of late, so there's not much activity going on. But he was like yelling, like he was just sort of like screaming his head off, and he was kind of kicking his bag, or it was like maybe like a plastic container or something, like it was something that was making noise, like down the street. No crime happening, like there's no real property damage happening except maybe to this like discarded garbage or his bag or whatever on the street. Calling the cops, there's a good chance that's going to escalate that situation, right? A lot of the folks that we work with, they see a uniform and they know they're going to either be in trouble, they're going to get laughed at, they're going to be told to move along, they're going to be ticketed, etc., etc. So you can call the non-emergency and say, hey, this fella's having a rough go. I can hear him. He's on X street. He's going this direction. If you get a call in the next little bit, it's probably him. But I'm just letting you know to maybe swing by, but don't come in, guns blazing, basically, right? And that can maybe help just that person take the time that they need to work off whatever frustration it is that they're upset with, or for their substance use to change, right? If they're coming down from a substance, right? And again, it's not that if you see something that's happening, absolutely, call the police. Or if you're concerned that something will happen, then absolutely call the police. But there is some escalation that can happen when the police are involved. Emotional release. This one's very, very common. They're all common, but this one we see a lot of the time, where you have really, really high energy and then a decrease in emotion, right? Where they're feeling a lot of shame, a lot of upset, and a lot of regret in terms of how they spoke to you. Validating feelings, but then reinforcing boundaries for yourself. You don't want to get pulled into a role that you can't play or that you don't want to play. So we responded to an individual who was outside a value village, and he had his backpack, and he was like throwing stuff out of his backpack, right? Like in general, just kind of causing mayhem. And it would be akin a bit to like if you saw a toddler having a tantrum like in a grocery store, where you were like, oh, like feel bad for the mom or whatever, right? And you just sort of keep walking, go down the next aisle. So it was a bit like that, where you just were like, oh, like I don't think there's anything I can do for this guy, but like, damn, he's like having a rough moment here. And he was throwing his stuff, and he was just mad. He was so mad. And we approached, and again, like distance, kind of called to him, like, and we happen to know, if you know their name, it's very, very helpful, because then again, that can distract them enough to say, hey, why does this person know my name, or how can I interact with them? And it was, he said, his name was Ethan. He said, Ethan, like, and I kind of again bent down because he was like head bent over in his bag, like, Ethan, man, like, what's going on, like, kind of explain this. And again, it's casual, it's friendly, it's almost joking, like, buddy, this isn't, nobody wants this to be happening right now, like, help me help you, sort of thing, right? So again, it's very casual, I'm setting a tone that I want him to match. And he was, F this and F that, which is, I will say, I'm gonna swear, it's very common, like, oh, John, come on, hey, come on into the shelter, yeah, fuck you. Okay, great, well, we're still gonna help you into the shelter here, John, like, let's see what it is that's bothering you. Maybe you have wet socks. That's very common, like, if they don't have shoes or don't have socks. I don't know about you, but, like, wet socks? No, that, like, I don't know how you have the peace of mind to even have to be civil to somebody if you have, that happening to you all the time, you've been walking for hours, you haven't eaten. All of these things, right, are factors that are contributing to how somebody's interacting with you. It's not personal, right? But again, he's throwing stuff, he's F this, F that, and I just sort of waited, right, like, just waited, gave him some time to keep throwing things around, and he said, Ethan, man, like, come on, tell me what's up. And immediately, again, just that persistence, that openness, right, that willingness to just sort of wait for him to sort of come to you. Huge decrease in emotion. Oh, I'm so sorry, and he was upset because he, in his words, well, my mom's ashamed of me, I wasn't able to make it through detox again, and that's where he was just shame, right? That was where that emotion was coming from. It was just straight built from shame that he had internalized. And so we respond, you validate feelings. Ethan, that must have been terrible for you. I'm so sorry to hear that happened. Your mom doesn't think that, right? Validating some of those emotions that he's got, and then reinforcing boundaries as needed, right? This is less of an issue when you're talking about people who are social workers, who are out there to do outreach, but it is important for community members. You don't want to be pulled into a role of counselor or, a healthcare worker, etc., because it's not the role that you should or could play, right? So you reinforce boundaries. I'm going to help you sit down over here. I'm going to grab you coffee, and then I have to get back to work, right? Just establish boundaries. Maybe you have to say, I'm actually meeting somebody else, right? So that you can disengage at some point. That's fine, right? You need to do what you need to do to make it a safe situation. But when we can interact, when we can be that voice to somebody, it makes a huge difference in terms of their ability to have a neutral or more positive or just a better outcome for that interaction. That's the entire goal, right? Is to make things not negative. Doesn't mean that you solved their problems, you didn't house them, you didn't give them the medicine that they needed, etc., but you were able to make that interaction better, right? There was some kindness there, and they were able to feel less alone for that part. I hate this slide, but we use it a lot because it's very, very helpful. People are people, these are humans that you're talking about, and we forget the humanity. It's one of the best things about working with Alpha House is that you get to see the humanity of clients that is so often overlooked because they're, quote unquote, an addict or a junkie, or they're homeless and they're whatever, and we just toss out these words to describe people who have, who grew up and have childhood memories and who have, experiences and values and family and friends and all of these things. The humanity often gets missed a lot of the time. I'll never forget, it was my first shift. I was in the shelter in Calgary, and there was a fellow who was leaving for the night, and he was singing in the Hallelujah, and he had the most beautiful voice, and I just remember, and it stuck with me because it was my first day, but I just remember thinking, like, how many people, are beautiful singers, and they're singing in church, and they're singing in choirs, and all these things, and this fella who has just hit this rough patch, he's just had a rough upbringing, or he's landed in just a crappy situation, just doesn't have that, and he's got these skills and talents and all of these things that all of our clients do, and they just get pushed aside because they're homeless, they're an addict, right? And we just attribute these words to them instead of these other words like singer or friend or human, right? So apologies for the monologue there, but yeah, we see that a lot in terms of the lack of humanity with the folks that we serve, and we do these workshops and we try to bring that back to people. So this is for a very much longer time for a workshop. Oh my gosh, look at that timing. That's not bad, 5 minutes? That's pretty good. I didn't think I was going to be back that long time. Lethbridge Shelter is 24/7 online. Our stabilization center, I will say, is for all community members. If you know somebody who's struggling, it's not just folks who access our shelter who are able to access the detox program. So if you do, keep that number in your kind of back pocket. If you do have a friend of a friend who maybe can utilize that service. We do referrals to housing and addiction, long-term addiction treatment programs from the stabilization program, as well as mental health counseling and healthcare and all of these pieces. The shelter, that's a cell, that's a team lead cell number. It's 24/7, so if you've got donations to drop off or things like that, you can text or call that number, or if you see somebody near the shelter and you think maybe a welfare check would be a good thing. We don't always have the staff, but if you let them know that somebody's out there, we can send the staff on their community round to check on somebody. There's other resources. Actually, I think I saw at the front there was a resource sheet. So yeah, hopefully you guys can grab one of those. And then questions. Anybody has any questions? Yeah, the safety one. There we go. Thanks. So our transitional housing program is no longer operating because it doesn't have funding to operate, which is very unfortunate. The other ones, so there's not a ton, but Lethbridge Family Services has a couple. River House, thank you, and the other one, but I can't recall. Sasha also has one that are housing. I mean, there's not a lot, right? There's not a lot of options. Those are permanent supportive housing programs, those ones mentioned, where the expectation isn't that somebody graduates, right? They're there for the remainder of their life, so need supports for the remainder of their life. We're talking about a spectrum of housing. What's needed really is some independent options where they have a caseworker who checks in on them, occasionally, where they have 24/7 supports, where there's group programming, where there's mental health, etc. Not a lot of options, but there's three, and Lethbridge Family Services would be a good connector. Lethbridge Housing Authority also has some low-income options as well. The process for housing, supportive housing programs typically is a meeting with all the housing programs, and they go through a list of individuals who are on, who have expressed interest in terms of their housing, and they look at where they have openings, basically. So they work. It's a good collaboration in terms of the agencies in the city.
So one other question, not a question, just a comment. Workshop. Myself as a director of my own workshop, I did like a number of times because I would like to do all sort of better information on the main street, white people, their perception of us, and then sort of friendship, so that I not only target people that I already members, but I like to share that. And there's been a lot of interest to back and forth perception.
Yes.
And this is how we do all services. Maybe better partnerships and other people. And how I found to do something to all of us. What do you, as a white person, expect of our people in the city? We said to be like us. I said, how? We can never get white. I said, no. Go to school, work in the days, and all services like that, which is pretty awkward. So I'm just saying that I would like to hear the perceptions from our brothers and sisters here. And this way we can advocate.
No, I appreciate that, and that is a time constraint because we typically do some of those group discussions when we have a bit more time. So absolutely, that's very important. That's okay. We're right at the hour. I don't know if there's any follow-up. I think there's still coffee, there's still donuts. I'm sure you can still help yourselves.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you Shaundra. That was a really, really interesting presentation to start our downtown education, safety education and information series. This is the first four that we've had this year, and then what we're hoping to do is put one on every month. And we're very, very interested in what the public would like to learn about with respect to the safety in downtown strategies, schools, etc. So we will be coming to you, and also please do fill out that survey. You can access it with a QR code. It's quick and dirty, and it gives us a lot of really good information. So thank you once again, Shaundra. I will be chatting with Shaundra to see whether or not there are any other presentations up their sleeves. If some folks that are at the house certainly do seem to have their finger on the pulse of what is going on, not only in Lethbridge, but across the country, across North America, and indeed the world. So once again, thank you so much. Keep your eyes and ears peeled for the next session. There is a short schedule there that takes us up to the middle of December, and it is absolutely wonderful to see you all. I'm really grateful that you've taken the time out today to learn a little bit more about how we can engage with, be more empathetic to, and just live in a more peaceable society, taking into account everybody's